There's a new report out showing exactly how much Uber drivers and Lyft drivers are making right now. Let's check it out. So this is on Business Insider. How much do Uber and Lyft drivers really make? It wildly depends. That's kind of the overarching idea of this article. So let's go through it, right? As you can see right here, in terms of pay transparency laws, what's weird is ride-hailing drivers for companies such as Uber and Lyft, it's still very murky, right? And that's what's super weird. Over the last few years, studies have come to a wide range of conclusions about drivers' hourly pay, as low as $9/$12 an hour and as high as $23 and $28 an hour. Now, when people ask me, I usually say the average amount, 20 to 25. In case you didn't know, your location is the number one factor that determines how much money you can make as a driver, which is very unfortunate, right? Because if you're in a bad area, even if you're the best rideshare driver ever, it just sucks, right? For lack of better words. So going here, Uber and Lyft have said that their typical driver earns about $35 and $36 an hour respectively. I have to be honest, I just call immediate BS. I think that if you talk to 99% of drivers, they're going to say there's no way that's what they earn an hour, right? I mean, if you maybe factor in luxury rides like Uber Black, Lyft Lux, those kind of like luxury and premium options, maybe. But I mean, even still, that means if that's like the average, for example, that means you need somebody who's making a lot more than this, and then of course a lot less than that, right? In addition, Insider's spoken with several drivers who pay has ranged from $22 to $40 an hour per their calculations, right? Now, here are the main factors that determine these discrepancies. First, the ride-hailing pay calculations that researchers, drivers, and companies use can vary considerably. And this is something I've talked about in previous videos, that where are they coming up with that number? Do they just ask 100 drivers? What's the analytics they're using? Some don't fully account for the expenses and hours that impact a driver's profits. They definitely don't. Things like being an independent contractor, the depreciation on your car. If you're renting a car, that's another fee. Like I've said before in other videos, the maintenance as well, in terms of more oil changes, having to get gas and the increased cost of gas. If, like, say you live in LA, you probably have to get more car washes, right? Because you want your car to look nice. If you want your car to be clean on the inside or get detailed, whatever. Second, drivers' pay can fluctuate based off how often they drive, their vehicle's expenses, and how well their customers tip. Tipping is a big thing. I've done some videos about how some drivers have reported by driving a Tesla, they're making significantly more money here in LA, which I think is important to mention when it comes to Teslas, right? Given the area you're in. By driving a Tesla, they're making significantly more money because it's a Tesla, and people typically tip higher. Regardless of how a driver calculates their hourly earnings, the ones Insider spoke with agreed that developing a method to assess and track one's pay is important. I've said this before in other pro tips, being able to, I think, have a quota or kind of track your analytics. And I've said this before in numerous videos, that when I first started driving, I was actually tracking the best times to drive in Boston. And that allowed me to make a lot more money. And in addition, because you're an independent contractor that can work whenever you want, right? Uber and Lyft is completely flexible. I mean, if you think about it, it's very easy to kind of slack off, so to speak, right? So I think having a quota, having kind of like a milestone or goal every week or every month or however you want to do it is a really good idea. So, and that's the thing. And this is a big one that's kind of frustrating. I mean, Lyft and Uber's gotten better with this. Back in the day, it was very likely, I remember, that you could do a ride, sit and wait in your car for 5 or 10 minutes, then get another ride. So there's a lag. Now, Uber and Lyft almost does this unique feature that they kind of switched over to this maybe like, was it 4 or 5 years ago? I can't remember. Where it's almost overlapping. As opposed to, you do a ride, the ride ends. You do another ride, the ride ends. Now you can accept a ride before the other ride ends. So by the time you drop somebody off, you already have another queue set up, which makes the efficiency a lot better, you making more money. And as you can see here, that these figures, the hourly figures I just showed you, it's the period between a driver accepting a ride and completing a trip. But of course, as you can see here, they use their online work hours, the time they have the app open, to determine their per hour pay. That's a little bit different, right? By accounting for the time between rides, which a driver might use to, relocate to a higher demand area, fill up their gas tank, maybe grab some food, go to the bathroom, they said this provides a more accurate reflection of their earnings, right? And so that's a big thing. The drivers demand justice study took a similar approach. It said it used all work time to determine a driver's hours. And, as you can see here, for drivers who are sensitive with what rides they accept, the difference between active and online pay can be substantial. Over the past 5 years, this one driver, Gabe, calculated that his pay per online hour was about $15 and $20 less than his earnings per active hour. That is a huge, huge thing. And I mean, it makes sense. We're humans. We're not robots. Like I mentioned, we have to stop and get some gas. We have to get some food. We might maybe take a pause and go to the bathroom, but not even just that. If you're trying to optimize your earnings, if, like, say I'm in LA, for example, and I'm in a hot spot on Friday night, like say I'm in the peak of West Hollywood, which the hot spots there's kind of like right by a bar called the Abbey and stuff like that. If I actually got brought out from the Abbey all the way to Reseda in the Valley, nobody is really ordering Ubers or not that much in Reseda in the Valley. Now, granted, sometimes you can get lucky, and we've all been there where you drop somebody off in a hot spot, you get brought back out to like more of a remote area, and then luckily, just luckily, someone takes a ride to go back into the hot spot. I find that's a very typical kind of swing, but it's very random though, right? There's been times I've been brought out and I'm in the most remote part of anywhere, and I'm like, I'm not getting any rides, and any rides I get are like somebody's house to someone's house that's like a mile or two away, and I'm like, I'm not going to get anything good. And sometimes you do get lucky where you're able to kind of like get that ride and then come back in, but it's, still super frustrating. I'm going to X out these ads. Oh, this is one that's just going to keep looping? Okay, there we go. So another big thing that I've mentioned in other videos, driving expenses such as gas and maintenance reduce drivers' profits. 5 drivers told Insider that their driving expenses, including gas and maintenance, remember this does depend upon your area. Your location is the most important factor to determine how much money you can make. So this does depend. But their gas and maintenance amounted to be about $4 to $8 an hour. So this amount as well did not count for expenses, which is why I think when I've done videos saying, like Lyft says the average driver makes, $36 an hour, every driver calls BS because they're not factoring in everything else. And like I've said in a lot of recent videos, I'm going to bring this up, it's this odd, frustrating, and annoying paradox that only exists really with Lyft and Uber, maybe other businesses too, but I think especially when it comes to Lyft and Uber, where the more that you drive, the more money you have to spend to drive. So yeah, you may be making more money because you're driving an extra 10 or 20 hours a week, but that means you also have to now spend more money in order to do that. And it's kind of like, it's not like, I said this before in other videos, it's not like me bartending. The more hours I worked, the more money I make. What, I have to maybe drive to and from work? Maybe that's it. The more YouTube videos I make, the more money I'm going to make. It's not like I have to incur a YouTube uploading fee or a camera fee. By the way, I use my iPhone to record all my videos. So it's like, and going down here, another big thing is electric vehicles. I've done videos about this. I'm going to kind of skim the surface. But one driver, for example, said that driving an electric vehicle saved him over $1,000 a month in gas and maintenance costs. So I've done some videos about driving a Tesla or an electric vehicle, if it helps your cost or not. And then, of course, customer tips. These are very random. I mean, I get asked a lot, how people tip, the psychology of the tipping. And one big video I did, as I'm kind of scrolling through this, is I mentioned that ride-sharing is the only industry I can really think of that you should be tipping, yet most people are not. And I think there's 2 reasons. One is the social stigma, right? We've all been there now. It's getting a little ridiculous, I will say, with other industries, that when you get done ordering God knows what, they flip that thing around, they say, they're just gonna ask you a few questions. And you're like, great, now you feel awkward of them standing there like this. As you look down, it says, do you want to tip them 20, 25, or 30% because you just bought a bottled water? And you're like, why the F am I... and this is true, I went to a concert venue recently, Sound Nightclub. Hate to call them out, but it is kind of weird. And I get that maybe it's just the accounting software, but I went to Sound Nightclub recently for an EDM event, for a DJ event. I bought a ticket for $5, I was like, $5 to get in. And they flip the thing around and they're like, do you want a tip? I'm like, who's this? I mean, if it's going to the artist, I'd be down for that because I love supporting live music. But I'm like, you're asking me to tip and I think it just goes to maybe the venue or the person asking, tipping is getting ridiculous, but with ride sharing, there's not that social stigma. When you leave that ride, the driver doesn't really know if you tip them or not, if you are going to tip them or not. I think the second big thing is the way it's kind of set up. It's very easy when it comes to Lyft and Uber to just hit that rating and close out, right? I think with a bar, you're forced to kind of sign a slip or a receipt before you leave that bar or something. I think when it comes to ride sharing, though, it's very easy to be like, oh, thank you. You close out the app. You don't think anything of it. I think if there's maybe more of a strict policy, maybe that'd make it better in place. I don't know how to do that, though. What the best approach would that be? And then lastly, I might as well say, too, back in the day, I remember this when I used to drive, Lyft and Uber was aggressively strict, saying you never, ever tip your driver. Then they took that back. Now it's becoming more common to tip, and it has been getting better. But I think it's very unfortunate that because of, I think, Lyft and Uber kind of put that mentality or ideology into the ride-sharing world, it's taking it a lot longer to be a common thing. You always tip your bartender. You always tip your waiter. You always tip your taxi driver. You always tip your limo driver. But ride-share drivers, just Lyft and Uber. No big deal, right? So getting into that, with that being said, let's get into the tips now. As you can see, your pay, especially when you look at everything being considered, can wildly depending on your tips. There have been days where I received, this one driver said, there have been days where I received 0 tips. There have been days where I received a tip every single ride, right? Depends on the mood of the city. And then tips make about 10 to 20% of their income in Colorado, which is interesting. But then in Portland, Oregon, which, by the way, so many requirements to drive in Portland. I don't know why, but anyway. If it weren't for tips and ride bonuses, his earnings after expenses would have fallen to about 24 to 13. That's a massive jump, right? That's almost $10 an hour difference given bonuses. And, of course, the fact of tips. Now, part-time drivers, this is a big one. I've mentioned before, I hated driving for Lyft and Uber part-time, love doing it full-time. They can sometimes see higher pay. They earn about $40 an hour after taking out expenses. He's only able to do this because he's now a part-time driver. He works about 15 to 20 hours a week, and he drives only during the busy hours and cherry picks high-paying rides. This is something I've mentioned so many times that if you think about it, if let's say you're driving 20 hours, I'm just making numbers up. If let's say you drive 20 hours a week, and let's say for those 20 hours of you driving, you make $500. Well, most people would think, using math, 20 hours a week equals $500. So if I had to ask you, if you drive 40 hours a week, what would you make? Now, most people would say, well, 1,000, right? If you're doubling the amount that you're driving, you're going to double the amount that you're going to make, right? It's pretty simple math. No, not in the case of being an Uber and Lyft driver. If anything, that jump, and I'm making numbers up, right, but I'm just kind of speculating. If I were to go from 20 hours to 40 hours, because now the extra time I'm driving is not pretty much during the peak hours, is only a handful or a select amount of peak hours, I might go from making $500 in 20 hours to maybe $750 in 40 hours, right? So even though I'm doubling the amount that I'm driving, I'm not doubling the amount that I'm making, which is why I think part-time 100% the way to go when it comes to Uber and Lyft. And you don't have to worry about deactivation, all these huge issues that have been coming up. And he said when he drove full-time, he earned between $25 and $35 an hour after expenses, even though now he makes about $40 an hour, right? I think making $30, $50 an hour is a pretty sweet for part-time job where I have no schedule and very little accountability for anyone but my passengers and my family. And I agree with that, honestly. I think that's very, very true. I mean, this amount, making $30 to $50 an hour, granted, I know that depends on your location, a lot of different factors. That's probably more, maybe the same, if not more, of what I would make as an accountant, even though I had to go to college for a 4-year degree, student loans, a lot of studying, a lot of work, all this kind of stuff for accounting, yet you can make that same amount just driving, and most people in this day and age have at least a driver's license, which allows you to potentially rent a car or use your own. And this is an interesting one in terms of minimum wage laws. Now, this is where the article kind of ends, so this is kind of like the last point they want to make. And that is that the number of drivers hit a record 5 million in 2022, with over 70% of new drivers citing inflation as the reason why they joined the platform. Last fall, Lyft said it had its highest number of active drivers in the last 2 years. Now, this is a big thing. In New York, Seattle, and California, drivers have received a bit more clarity on their income through the adaptation of minimum wage laws, but whether other states will follow suit has yet to be seen. Now, I have to be honest when it comes to that. I think that that's actually a massive thing. I've mentioned this before in other videos. After Prop 22, a big thing that happened in California, among a lot, right? And Prop 22, in case you didn't know, was the battle. Should you be an independent contractor or an employee? Drivers are still independent contractors here in California. But one clause of that, among the many clauses, but probably the biggest one, is you get a minimum hourly guarantee. And there were times where I was driving to Boston where this did not exist. I drive on a Tuesday from like 1 to 2 p.m., pretty dead hour, and I'd maybe make like $3 for one ride or $5, something ridiculous. At least there's a minimum hourly guarantee here in California. So at least you know you're going to make a certain amount, but even still, and I've mentioned this before, it is still unfortunate and very annoying that the more that you drive, the more you have to spend when it comes to these expenses. I've gotten a lot of comments on this channel of people saying, don't do Lyft and Uber, just become a fast food worker, just flip burgers. And they're not wrong. You know, I mean, if you look at a company like In-N-Out, which, by the way, is a great company to work for. I have no affiliation with In-N-Out, by the way, but I love In-N-Out. Huge fan of In-N-Out. I mean, they give you benefits part-time. I think it's like almost $20 an hour you make flipping burgers on a fast food restaurant. They're a very reputable company to work for, et cetera, et cetera. And guess what? Your only expense, really, when you go to In-N-Out is to get to and from the In-N-Out location. I mean, would you rather make a steady $20 an hour, knowing no matter what you're going to make that, and just be working in a fast food restaurant and not incur any expenses, or would you drive for Lyft and Uber, which the price can be kind of, the pay, can be all over the place. You have to spend more money for maintenance, spend more money for gas. You worry maybe more about taxes, right? That's a whole other thing. You definitely have to hire a tax accountant, keep track of your receipts more. It's a little bit more work. Plus the whole fear of deactivation, the liability of being on the road more, dealing with insurance. I mean, again, I've done so many videos about this already. And again, these are some new reports that have been coming out as they've been interviewing and studying a lot more Lyft and Uber drivers, especially in this day and age. And I think at the end of the day, to sum up the past like 20 videos I've done about this, the pay for Uber and Lyft drivers is not increasing. It's decreasing, especially because Uber and Lyft is taking out a lot more money, and you're not having to spend a lot more money in expenses and costs, which means you're making less and paying more,